welcome to my channel. I'm Tiffany, a retired librarian turned homeschool mom. And in this video, we're going to talk about an interesting story about how two Mormons ended up dead in Victorian London. So what on earth am I talking about? A Study in Scarlet, the first story to star Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. So it is December, though I am filming this on the 17th of November. And I don't have a copy. I read this on my tablet. But this is a very interesting story. Again, this is our introduction to Sherlock Holmes. So the first part of it, we get the backstory of Dr. Watson, how he went to medical school. He was part of the military. He was in Afghanistan. He ended up injured. Then he ended up sick. And then he was sent home and was still very weak, recovering, and living in a hotel and realizing he can't keep living like this because he was running out of money. And so he happened to run into an old friend from medical school who happened to mention that he knew somebody else who was looking to share lodgings. So he's introduced to Sherlock Holmes, who is very peculiar. And they end up sharing lodgings. And you kind of get the backstory of how Sherlock interacts with him and Sherlock's behavior, his playing of the violin, and odd things going on. And then you get a message from one of these Scotland Yard detectives to come to an abandoned house where there is a body. So they come in and they look at the body, and Sherlock Holmes talks to them a little bit. They find writing on the wall. Sherlock Holmes decides to go examining everything with a tape measure and a magnifying glass. Then proceeds to tell the detectives, yeah, the thing written on the wall isn't named for Rachel. It's German for revenge. The person who committed the murder was like over 6 feet tall, and I think a few other things. And of course they're like, what? And of course Watson has no clue. So they leave. He to catch a cab, and which of course is a horse-drawn cab here. This is, I believe, 1881 is when the story takes place. But and Watson's like, how on earth? He's like, I examined things like stuff in the dust. The guy was probably poisoned. There was a cab that had three old shoes and one new. It's like, what? Of course, typical, as you come to know Sherlock Holmes here. So, Sherlock Holmes goes off to listen to a musical concert after leaving a telegram. They're sending a telegram, and Watson goes home because he's tired again. He's recovering from sickness and injury and watching people be blown up in Afghanistan. Because, yeah, the British were in war in Afghanistan. Victorian era. So, sorry, it is 8:53 at night. So, after all of this, you switch to a very interesting story that has nothing to do with Victorian London, where you have a man and a small child who are dying in the wilderness plains of America. They are come upon by several Mormons who say, if you agree to our religion, we'll save you. So they do. It turns out this man and this young girl are not related, but they are the last of a wagon train, and everybody else had died from disease and starvation. So the Mormons, which are on their way to what will eventually become Utah, until the Great Salt Lake, take them on. They agree to the wedding. This guy commits to the religion, is very, very helpful in guiding them to the Great Salt Lake. So he ends up being given a decent piece of land and turns it into a rather large farm. He becomes very, very wealthy. And all this time he's raising his adopted daughter, and of course he does not take on wives. Remember, Mormons were still being led by Brigham Young at this point. I can't remember whether or not he's dead yet. But they're into polygamy. This is the Victorian era. So he doesn't take on wives. And then the young girl becomes of age, and she meets a gentleman who's not Mormon, and she kind of falls in love. He comes to visit multiple times. He proposes, he asks the father, can I marry her? He says yes, because he doesn't want her marrying a Mormon, because polygamy. And he goes off and says, like, I'll be back. I need to go deal with these mines. In the meantime, the father is approached. It's like, your daughter has not married. The two heads of the Council of Four, which are the heads of the Mormon Church, have sons who want to marry your daughter. So you have a month before she gets to predict between the two of them. And so he's like, oh, fun. Okay. Problem here. Daughter doesn't want to marry either one of these guys. They already have multiple wives. So she's maybe about 18. So yeah. And again, already engaged. So he pisses them off. He sends word to the fiance. The fiance shows up. It's like, your house is constantly being watched. We need to get the heck out of here. So they get the heck out of here. At one point in time, he separates from them. And the father is murdered by the Mormons. We're chasing them. And the daughter is kidnapped and taken back, forcibly married. And then I believe she just kind of dies of a broken heart. She's miserable. And therefore she dies. And then the two young sons, who she was supposed to marry, one of which she did marry, leave Mormonism and run off. And they're already kind of wealthy. So this young gentleman is chasing them for revenge. So, yeah. And then it switches back to Watson. And and this is kind of how they find out. This is the story. And eventually Sherlock Holmes, the detectives comes, it's like, we've arrested this guy. He beat the crap out of this other guy, about the guy who was murdered. But then the other detective found somebody else who was murdered in a hotel, who was this guy's secretary. And they think they have it settled. And Holmes is like, yeah, no. And they're irritated, as they are. And basically he had summoned. Now, prior to this, I believe this in Italy, they had this wedding ring, which they found. It's like, there's a woman involved. And Sherlock Holmes is like, yeah, this was done by a man. So he puts a notice in the newspaper, and somebody comes for the old lady, claims for the ring. Turns out it's not an old lady, because Sherlock Holmes decides to chase him. And then, of course, he loses him because there is nobody in the carriage when he arrives at the destination, because the guy had jumped out, because it wasn't an old woman. But he figures he had sent, of course, that telegram away to Cleveland, in Ohio, because that's seemingly where this gentleman who had died had come from, because they did have their names, and there was no robbery. So he had gotten information. So he summons this cab driver, and this is our murderer. And they capture him, and he reveals that, yeah, he's been chasing these two guys. That whole backstory, he's the late gentleman who was engaged to the young lady who had died. That was her wedding ring. She died of, like, misery. And he had been chasing these guys for a long time. But because they had money, he did not. It was difficult. He became a cabbie. Once they settled in London, they decided to separate. And so he was able to get this guy alone. He'd actually been staying at other lodgings, and he was, because he's arrogant, was going to insist on taking this woman's daughter. And then the son, like, beat the crap out of him. Because it's like, how dare you just kind of come in here and tell my daughter to come marry you. Like, you'll be rich, come along. And she was like 17. And so, yeah, the brother beat the crap out of him. And then he goes and gets very, very, very drunk and ends up in the cab of our murderer, who eventually takes him to, it's like, where can I take this guy to just get rid of him? But I want him to know it's me. So they end up in an abandoned house, and he forces him to take the poison. Basically, he has a box, one with poison, one with not. And both of them take them. And, of course, the intended murder victim dies. Because he's kind of supposed to. And according to, in this guy's mind, it's divine intervention. Of course, that God would determine that this man who had kidnapped and forcibly wed this young woman died because he did wrong. And even though this guy goes like, I didn't murder the father. Of course, I was probably his secretary, or which was his friend, the other guy who would have married the girl, depending on who they decided to choose. So and then, of course, our murderer goes to kill the secretary and knows the guy. He never leaves the hotel because he realizes something's up. And so he uses a random ladder and goes in, tries to do the same thing, but this guy just kind of attacks him, and they end up killing him with a knife, defending himself. So, and that's pretty much not necessarily how it ends, but that's what happened. And, of course, Sherlock Holmes explains and everything. Of course, they get in the carriage because they're going to take him to Scotland Yard. And the guy asks Watson, it's like, you're a doctor. Listen to my heart. He has an aneurysm, and he could die at any minute. So he goes to Scotland Yard and ends up dying the next day. It's just heart. He dies. His heart stops. Blood vessel breaks, and he's dead. So, which of course, again, irritates the people because this murderer he died in prison. Literally within 24 hours. And then Sherlock goes into the explanation of how he knew all of this to Watson. And Watson thinks it's amazing. It's like, why don't you write this down? It's like, if you won't, I will. And Sherlock Holmes is like, okay. And that's really it. That is the end of A Study in Scarlet. So it's very, very interesting. Obviously, Doyle does not look positively upon Mormons, which needed the U.S. government at the time, because polygamy, they made them stop, or they wouldn't be able to become a state. It's like, yeah, don't do that. We don't approve of that. So the Mormons stopped, at least most of them, the main Mormons. Then there's like 3 or 4 sects that are still wandering around committing polygamy and incest. Not this story. And more modern information. But it's kind of interesting. This, again, is the first. You get the backstory of Watson. That's my chair. And I do have a cat in my lap. You can see the ear right here. That is Kendra, if you're familiar with my channel. Kendra is my 15-year-old calico. Laying in the lap, actually behaving this time. But it is an interesting tale. Trying to think of what age. Probably middle school and up. Obviously, there's going to be children's versions of this, which I believe cut out the Mormon part because it's very, very weird. And it's like you have Watson. Then we're going to go all the way to the United States to these men and child who are dying. And then they're rescued by Mormons. And it's a whole other tale in the middle of this book. So it's very, very interesting. But I do enjoy Sherlock Holmes. It is a classical mystery. And again, this is the first story where you learn about Watson and about how him and Holmes come together. It's also interesting to think that their lodging homes literally consist of 2 bedrooms and a living space. That's it. Their food is brought to them by the woman who owns the house. They are splitting the space. It's, of course, I'm assuming the woman who owns the house handles their laundry and all their cooking and provides food and everything for them, which probably made sense for bachelors back then. I mean, makes interesting sense. I do think Watson marries later. But again, this is the very first story of Sherlock Holmes. I'm not sure how long it is. It probably varies. But again, I'm thinking middle school and up. I don't think you should read this to younger children just because blood, murder, polygamy, forced marriage. I don't think they would get it. Middle school and up would be interesting, particularly if they're... But again, there's probably children's versions of this. So it's an interesting tale. I have not actually read it. I will be doing a few more Sherlock Holmes this December, and we will probably do it more because I'm going to be doing mysteries every December. So if you like what you see, be sure to like and subscribe. There is the cat in the background there. That is what she looks like. If you haven't seen my previous videos, I will be doing a lot of fairy tales in 2025. So if you're interested in escaping from the world with me, be sure to check out those channels. I am only doing 2 videos a week next year. I'm not going to attempt to do a book series just because that proved too difficult. I do have a 5-year-old. She will be 5 and a half at the end of January, and she's a bit of a handful for various reasons. So, but check out the rest of my channel. I have a lot to look at if you want to check out all my videos. So, and look forward to a bunch of deep dives into various fairy tales coming in 2025. Thank you.